Did it work? Yeah, nice. Okay, maybe we'll just wait a couple of minutes for people to join and then start. I think it's streaming now, right? Yeah. Oh, I can hear myself. Somebody has the stream open. I can hear myself on it. Delay. Abhishek, is that you? Oh, it's me. Oh, it's me. Sorry. Yeah. That's me. Sorry.
I'm muted on both the windows.
Right. Yeah. My fault. All right, should we get started? Seem to have some people who've already joined. Abhishek, do you want to start the recording? Okay, thanks everyone for joining us again today for the second in our series of invited talks for the winter school. And today the theme of the day has been scientific understanding. So we're going to have a talk on that theme from Professor Angela Potochnik. I'm sorry, I checked beforehand, still got it wrong initially. And she will be speaking on non-factive understanding and scientific progress. Professor Potochnik is at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Cincinnati. She's also the director of the Center for Public Engagement with Science. She works on issues involving understanding, explanation, idealization, and she is the author of a wonderful book that I recommend that you all read called Idealization and the Aims of Science. So I'm sure this is going to be a great and instructive talk. So please go ahead, Professor Potochnik. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me as part of this. I'm really excited to interact with you all. All right, so I have to first do the dance of figuring out how to share my screen so that you can see my slides, which I'm doing now. And then let's see, go to Keynote. Play. All right, do things look as they should?
Yes, they do, I think.
Excellent. All right, well, again, thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I will be discussing, it's sort of a cumbersome title, but non-factive understanding, but I'll explain what I mean by that and why I'm talking about it. And then sort of taking this perspective on understanding how we might, how this might give us sort of an interesting perspective also to take on the nature of scientific progress. So that's where I'm headed. Oops. Okay, and the starting point really, as sort of in a way that shows that there's a relationship between this talk and the 2017 book that already came up, is in talking about idealizations and the role of idealizations in science. And so in particular, philosophers of science increasingly are attending to the role of idealizations, and it seems the importance of idealizations in generating scientific understanding. So by idealizations, I mean particularly, and sort of getting this exactly right matters for the points that I want to make today. What I mean by idealizations are assumptions made without regard for whether they're true, often with full knowledge that they're false. So examples include, in these sort of meant in ways that I mean to indicate with these silly pictures that I have on this first slide here, the assumption sometimes made in physics that a given plane is frictionless, when we know that friction always obtains, basically. The assumption in biology that some population of organisms is infinite in size. Of course, if we took long enough, we could count any given population of organisms. None is infinite in size, but it's in a variety of different scientific contexts useful to assume that populations are infinite. Simplifies the math in all sorts of ways. And then finally, a well-known assumption in a lot of approaches in economics that humans are perfectly rational agents. Again, we are very clear that humans are not perfectly rational agents, but it can be useful in some contexts, and arguably, so other economists take other approaches, but it can be useful, it seems, in some contexts to assume we are perfectly rational. So some also use, in some philosophers of science, also use idealization to refer to representations that involve idealizations in this sense, right? So I'm talking specifically about the false assumptions. Some also say that you have an idealization when, for example, you employ the ideal gas law, which I'll use in an example later in this talk. It's important for my purposes to distinguish between idealizations themselves, that is the false posits, and the idealized representations that these false posits facilitate. So put briefly, I think it may be that idealized representations, right, the ideal gas law, et cetera, maybe when we use those to help us understand the world, maybe they are approximately true or et cetera. But I also think it's clear that idealizations themselves, right, these assumptions that humans are perfectly rational agents and populations are infinite, et cetera, that those are false, or at least not claimed by scientists to be true. And that matters, I think, the role that those play in our projects of explanation and understanding. Okay, so moving on from that to explain this term in my title of non-factivism. Factivism, or increasingly I like the term veritism, about scientific understanding, is the idea that truth is a requirement for legitimate understanding. Some philosophers who have looked closely at how scientific models explain, or at the role of idealizations in science, have challenged this idea. So besides me and influencing me, this includes Catherine Elgin, Elisa Bakulich, Henk Direct, and others. Other philosophers have, in response to this sort of an argument, motivated ways to accommodate idealization's contribution to understanding, while also remaining committed to the idea that only truths explain, only truths sort of contribute epistemically to our understanding. Those philosophers include at least Michael Strevens, who I think you'll hear from tomorrow on a different topic, Uskali Maki, Karim Khalifa, Insa Lawler, Chris Pincock, and others. One motivation for this idea, the idea that sort of we can make sense of the role of idealizations in generating understanding, but still maintain veritism, is that there must be an objective standard for legitimate understanding in order for this to qualify as an epistemic success. So that's the general problem space for my talk. I'm going to motivate the idea that understanding is non-factivism and address how we can talk about there being an objective standard for legitimate understanding, even if that is the case. In particular, I want to do three things. First, I'm going to say a little bit more about what I mean when I say that I'm non-factivist about understanding and explanation, or put another way, why I reject Veritism. So I'm going to kind of put a finer point on that idea. And as I mentioned, an important motivation for Veritism is the sense that there should be an objective standard for something to qualify as a legitimate explanation or legitimate understanding in order for this to qualify as an epistemic success in science. So after describing why I think I qualify as a non-factivist and sort of motivating this idea of non-factivism or the rejection of Veritism about understanding, I'm going to motivate an alternative standard for legitimate understanding that appeals to a broadened notion of epistemic acceptability rather than truth. I then argue that this revised standard for legitimate understanding better accommodates the nature of our present-day scientific understanding, as well as providing a natural interpretation, I think, of the idea that there is cumulative scientific progress. What I have to say in this talk is significantly based in ideas in my 2017 book on idealization, but I find that I'm getting clearer as time goes on what's at stake and the precise contours of my view and my argument. So hopefully this talk has something to offer, even for anyone who might already be familiar with that book. So note also that sometimes, I've already done this a little bit, I might move back and forth between talking about explanation and understanding. I think that producing explanations just is the systematic way that science has developed to generate understanding. So I suppose I'm primarily talking about explanatory understanding in this talk. And implicit here is the idea that this is a key form or the key form of scientific understanding. And if you're troubled by how I move between explanation and understanding at some stage of the talk, feel free to raise a question about it. And more broadly, at any point in the talk, so I'm less connected to you as an audience during this talk because of the Zoom interface, of course. So I can't sort of read expressions to sort of moderate my approach here. So if you sort of are troubled by something or have a quick question along the way that will be distracting to you as we continue, don't hesitate to just directly unmute yourself and say, hey, what about this? And of course, if it's a sort of more philosophical question that I'll need to address at length, that's a better thing to save for the Q&A at the end. But if I sort of my presentation goes awry, or you just have a quick question of something that I should have defined and I didn't along the way, feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so getting started, rejecting Veritism. How exactly the truth requirement for understanding on the perspective of Veritism is cashed out is, it seems, part of what is at issue in that debate. So here are a few illustrations of different possible requirements, some, but probably not all, related to views that philosophers actually have espoused. So I'm sort of abstractly trying to characterize what you might, grounds that you might have for thinking that you're dubious of the idea of Veritism about understanding, and then some grounds for thinking that maybe Veritism is true of understanding. So first, a sampling of considerations about whether we should reject Veritism. Should we reject Veritism? And this is sort of, like I said, this is articulating the broad problem space in terms of questions that we can ask, right, about sort of how Veritism actually should be defined. And I won't necessarily endorse any of these particular views, but I will go on to tell you why I think the views that I'm committed to are sufficient to reject Veritism on the basis of. So should we reject Veritism about understanding? That is the idea that understanding that what produces understanding must be true. If any posit contributing to a successful explanation is false, is that enough, right? Is the contribution of idealizations of false posits to successful explanations sufficient? What if a false posit contributes to an explanation's epistemic success? That is, so it's not, we might think that maybe the bar for Veritism isn't just if there's some idealization, some false posit that can support the explanation some way, but it supports it epistemically, right? It directly contributes to the epistemic success of the explanation. And that's a somewhat higher bar. Or, right, I think a higher bar still, maybe the debate about Veritism, maybe the line should be that we should reject Veritism if a successful explanation requires one to believe a false claim. It sure seems like that would be a sort of strong enough violation of a truth requirement to be a grounds for rejecting Veritism. But it also seems sort of correspondingly implausible of something that a non-veritist or a non-factivist would want to endorse. And then, so what about the grounds for Veritism? Should we endorse Veritism if a successful explanation taken as a whole must be approximately true? This is on this side of sort of pro-Veritism. This is maybe the lowest bar that we might take. Should we endorse Veritism if any claim posited as true in an explanation must actually be true? Right. So this sort of corresponds to the rejection, or it's the opposite view of the last option that I offered for possible grounds for rejecting Veritism. Or finally, should we endorse Veritism if only true claims contribute to an explanation's epistemic success? Okay, so it's worth pointing out that as these different options are meant to illustrate, at least two elements of the question are also at issue here. First, are we evaluating an explanation taken as a whole to determine whether we should be veritous about understanding? Or are we considering each individual contribution, that individual posits, as I've put it, claims contrary to the fact, etc. Individual posits contribute to the explanation. So, for example, is it enough for Veritism if an explanation is taken as a whole, approximately true of what it explains? Or alternatively, is it enough to reject Veritism if an individual posit that facilitates the explanation is false. That is, if there's one idealization in the explanation. Second, what counts as part of the explanation or as a contribution to the explanation? This is the second issue, I think, as sort of the question of how Veritism should be defined as a position. So part of what at issue, I believe, with the positions of Inso Lawler and Karim Khalifa in particular, who are Veritists and quasi-Veritists about understanding, is sort of whether the contributions that idealizations make to explanations are properly epistemic, or if they're sort of contributions that we can make sense of while still saying that all of the sort of properly epistemic contributions to understanding must be true. So these are sort of two features of two questions we need to resolve in articulating exactly what a Veritism would require. So I'll try to keep track of these two questions as I sort of try to get a handle on, from my perspective, why I reject Veritism. So here is what I mean, finally, now that I've sort of talked around the possible options, here's what I mean when I say that I reject Veritism. Of an explanation taken as a whole, I take it that Y can explain X. So I'm saying this entirely schematically, right? Y can explain X without being entirely true of the systems in question. Also note in passing that X, that is what is being explained, the assertion about the system that's being explained, may also not be entirely true of the system, right? It might be an approximation as well. That's also fine, but it's sort of incidental to the main point here. My main point is that one component of my rejection of Veritism is that we don't require complete truth, complete accuracy at least, of our explanations. Put in terms of understanding, we might say that some subject S can understand that X because Y without Y being entirely true. So it's a tired example, this toy example, but I find it very useful to appeal to in making clear the points that I'm making along the way. But I want to talk about the ideal gas law. So the ideal gas law, one thing that's convenient about it for my purposes is that the ideal gas law assumes that the gas in question is ideal. So that is assumes that we're dealing with a gas that is made up of point particles that don't take up space and that have no intermolecular attraction or repulsion among them. So this is an ideal gas for which this relationship PV equals nRT obtains, but scientists and others regularly use the ideal gas law to explain real gases as well. So to articulate in terms of this simple example, what my rejection of Veritism amounts to for explanation as a whole, I think that some subject S can understand that the pressure in a balloon doubled when the volume was cut in half because PV equals nRT. Even if PV equals nRT, even if the ideal gas law is not entirely true of this system, for example, if I remember my chemistry well enough, if the gas in the balloons is near room temperature and contains a good bit of water vapor, then we don't have a real gas that corresponds with behavior that corresponds exactly to an ideal gas, but it's close enough for explaining in this case why the pressure in the balloon doubled when the volume was cut in half. In other words, the ideal gas law can explain the pressure in the balloon doubling, even though the ideal gas law is not entirely true of the system. Also, though it seems this is maybe less at issue with those who endorse Veritism, S can understand that X because Y, as I said, without X being entirely true either. So in this same example, the pressure in the balloon did not precisely double. In at least some circumstances of explanation, that's okay. Even if the explanation seeker did not specify or is not even aware of this lapse, it's enough to sort of have an approximate description of the system that we go on to explain in a lot of different circumstances. Okay, but even if these claims that I've made are true, this is still consistent with the approximate truth requirement for both Y and X, the explanans and the explanandum they're often referred to. This is not so, I think, for individual posits involved in the explanation. So moving on, my rejection of Veritism also stems from a view about individual posits involved in an explanation. A posit P, we might say, so I use the word posit here to try to capture, as I sort of briefly said before, claims made contrary to fact, postulates, et cetera. So you might have lots of different sort of degrees of commitment to the truth of a claim, including claims made contrary to fact or idealizations. But I want to refer to all of those as just posits, as long as they're sort of individual claims or ideas. I wasn't sure what noun to use there, other than just posit, individual posits. Okay, so a posit P, I think, can be crucial for an explanation Y, where Y is the best explanation of some explanandum X, without being even remotely true. So crucial posits, in my view, to an explanation can be wildly false. And such posits count as part of Y explaining X, in the sense that Y would not account for X without them, right? So this posit can be crucial for the explanation Y of X, and Y can be the very best explanation of X. We can't do any better. And yet P can be not even remotely true. So for example, at least sometimes the ideal gas law best explains why the pressure doubled when the volume was cut in half. The ideal gas law requires assumptions that are true of no real gas. Strictly speaking, as I said, it applies only to ideal gases. These assumptions regard features of the gas that are difference makers, at least in Woodward's sense of the term, right? So intermolecular attraction and repulsion, gas particles taking up space, these are difference makers. So if we shift those features of gases, then we get different behavior of the gas. And moreover, the difference between one or more of the assumptions and the actual features of the gas may even be enough to affect the feature that is targeted in the explanation, such as the assumption of no intermolecular forces versus water vapors behavior at room temperature. So we have here then this explanation PV equals nRT that might be approximately true of the behavior of the real gas that we're explaining, but it isn't perfectly true of it. And then we have crucial posits made as part of this idealized explanation, namely the posits involved in presuming that the gas in question is ideal rather than real, that actually get things that matter about the real gas wrong in the course of explaining certain features of its behavior. So this, taken as sort of the part about the explanation as a whole, as well as the individual posits that contribute to understanding, this is a statement of why I reject Veritism. I've tried to address the contours of that debate as identified on my previous slide, sort of on the questions of how we should even define Veritism and the rejection of Veritism, including whether Veritism is a claim of individual posits or of an explanation as a whole. I've addressed both of those features, and also what should count as part of an explanation. Note, however, that I'm not here defending this view as the right one, or even defending this interpretation of what Veritism and Factivism requires. My aim in this talk is just to articulate the position. Of course, I also hope that my articulation is compelling enough that you're at least on board for the rest of this talk, even if I haven't convinced you to give up on Veritism. Okay, so moving on, does this rejection of Veritism mean that there is no objective standard governing an explanation's epistemic success? Does this entail that our best scientific explanations are just those that we find the most satisfying, regardless of how they relate to the world? And that any claim can be asserted, no matter how wrong? I sure hope not, right? These would be problematic implications of this. So what I'm going to do is try to convince you that one can agree to the specified claims that lead me to reject Veritism without thereby giving up an objective standard for when an explanation succeeds. And also for when individual posits can be sort of legitimate parts of an explanation without compromising the epistemic success of that explanation. So let's start with the standard for posits, the individual sort of assumptions or claims made as part of the explanation. On this, I draw from Kate Elgin's work, especially her 2004 paper, True Enough. Elgin calls this standard epistemic acceptability. That is, when a posit is epistemically acceptable to include in what we might say generically a scientific account of something or other. Importantly, Elgin's standard of epistemic acceptability is variable depending on the role a posit plays in a representation. So this is one really important development that Elgin is responsible for. Some posits contributing to a representation are claimed as true, and thus must be true to be epistemically acceptable, right? So if you claim that something is true, if your account claims something is true, then the epistemic acceptability of that claim requires truth. Any divergence from truth in this case is too much. On the opposite extreme, some posits are assumed with indifference to what is true or even explicitly contrary to fact. These posits can diverge significantly from the truth, so long as that divergence doesn't interfere with the success of the representation. This is what I show with condition A here. For Elgin, this is a standard for when a posit is, in her term, true enough. It's worth noticing that this standard does not commit non-factivists to the idea that explanations involve false claims or false assertions. Those claims and assertions, as I've said, must be true or at least approximately true. But there are many other epistemic attitudes that we may have toward posits, and at least one of those attitudes, assuming contrary to fact, is obviously important to scientific representation, insofar as idealized representation is a really common strategy in science, right? Go back to that sort of first slide where I sort of quickly gestured at the significance of idealization to physics, biology, as well as economics. I think a second condition is needed for epistemic acceptability beyond Elgin's standard. And again, Elgin's is sort of condition A here. In my view, the epistemic acceptability of posits, of individual posits in an account, is also relative to the aims to which the representation or the account is put. Important to my view of explanation is the idea that the same explanandum calls for different explanations in different explanatory contexts. So in different contexts of inquiry, put in terms of understanding, in different contexts of an inquiry, different scientific accounts are going to provide understanding. I'm not going to defend that idea today, but I've talked about this from lots of different angles in several places. Perhaps the sort of place where I get at this most directly is a 2016 article from the PSA proceedings, the Philosophy of Science Association proceedings. I will say that I think that this variability of what generates understanding is entailed by prominent views of explanation, including both Michael Strevens and Jim Woodward's. For Strevens, I'm thinking of the contrast in his 2008 book on explanation between complete explanations and exhaustive explanations. And for Woodward, I'm thinking of his emphasis that one needs to choose the set of causal variables before going on to assess causal explanations. So I don't think you have to believe anything particularly out there to generate this conclusion, right? This idea that in different circumstances where scientists seek to understand, different accounts will be what generates understanding for them. So why I think that this idea matters here is that I think different explanatory aims or trying to understand different aspects of an explanandum motivates different requirements for the epistemic acceptability of posits, especially assumptions contrary to fact, better known as idealizations. So here are a couple of quick examples for how this is supposed to work, for how this proposed standard of epistemic acceptability should work, and why, like I put it before, the sort of condition B matters. Why the epistemic purpose of the representation matters to whether some posit is epistemically acceptable or not. So first example, Elisa Bakalic in a 2009 paper discusses the closed orbit account of electron absorption under magnetic force. This account, the closed orbit account, employs the idealization that electrons follow fixed orbits. We know since quantum mechanics that this is false. This posit is not epistemically acceptable, thus, as a claim of classical mechanics taken as a theory. Indeed, scientists have refuted classical mechanics as a theory of subatomic particles, including the claim that electrons follow orbits. Nonetheless, this posit that electrons follow fixed orbits is epistemically acceptable as an idealization, an assumption contrary to fact in closed orbit theory. So this is something that physicists really do, right, today, even though we know classical mechanics is false as a theory. One difference is that the posit is not a claim, but an idealization. A second difference is that the goal is to understand a specific strange phenomenon of electron behavior. And this idealization is apt given that aim. It's useful in this circumstance. If the aim were instead to explain electron movement within atoms, this idealization would be unsuitable. It would have, entailments. This assumption of a fixed orbit would entail features of behavior that don't match what we see. So these two differences amount to the epistemic acceptability of the posit of fixed electron orbits, varying on the basis of both considerations A and B above, right? So first we have to think about the posit's role in the representation. That is, that it's assumed as an idealization rather than posited as true. But then second, we also need to think about what's being done with the representation such that this idealization is a useful one to make, leads us in the right direction. So second example, back to the idealization of infinite population size. This, as I mentioned, this idealization is common in population biology. And unlike electron orbits, this was initially introduced as an idealization. No biologist has ever claimed that some populations actually are infinite in size, of course. So any use of the infinite population size posit satisfies condition A. This is always introduced as an idealization. Acknowledged falsehoods can deviate dramatically from the truth, according to this account of epistemic acceptability, without epistemic harm. So we sort of can make sense of the use of idealizations, of this idealization with a standard for epistemic acceptability. But only some uses of this idealization of an infinite population are actually epistemically valuable. The assumption of an infinite population is useful because it enables biologists to ignore the role of genetic drift in bringing about some evolutionary outcome. Accordingly, this posit is epistemically acceptable as an idealization in an account of natural selection's role in bringing about some trait, for example, since the aim is then to set aside any influence of drift. But this, even though this is an idealization, so it always satisfies condition A, this idealization is not epistemically acceptable, even as an idealization, if the aim of the representation as a whole, or the account as a whole, is instead to represent the role of drift. The posit of an infinite population, in this case, directly interferes with achieving the aim of the representation. So this is sort of walking through two examples, trying to motivate the importance of condition B in my view of sort of my derivative view of Kate Elgin's for what's required for epistemically acceptable, epistemic acceptability of a posit that can sort of accommodate why we hold our claims of truth to a different standard than our claims, than our idealized assumptions, for example, on the opposite extreme. So this condition B, in my view, really matters. If the aim is to represent all the important evolutionary influences on some trait, jumping back into my example of infinite population. So now we're imagining that the goal is to represent all of the important evolutionary influences. This is a third possibility. Then the epistemic acceptability of assuming an infinite population depends on the causal facts. This idealization is epistemically acceptable, I think, if drift isn't an important evolutionary influence, but not if drift is an important influence. In that case, this assumption is sort of obscuring one part of the story that the scientists want to tell. And all of this, I think, comfortably fits, all of this variability comfortably fits within the condition B of the criterion for epistemic acceptability that I've suggested. Okay, so epistemic acceptability is the standard that I propose for individual posits, ranging from claims to idealizations to contribute to the epistemic success of an explanation. This is how we can talk about in assessing whether we should be veritous about explanation, whether and to what extent idealizations contribute to epistemic success. There's also, I think, a standard other than truth for a successful explanation. First of all, it sort of can't go wrong. That is, a successful explanation taken as a whole must include only epistemically acceptable posits. So keep in mind, of course, this can include idealizations alongside claims of truth and other styles of posits perhaps as well. But each of these needs to be epistemically acceptable, needs to satisfy the criteria I've outlined for epistemically acceptable, which is sort of has different requirements, places different requirements on idealizations compared to claims of truth. But this isn't sufficient. A successful explanation, an epistemically acceptable explanation, also must accomplish something in order to explain, right? It's not enough to not do wrong. You have to get somewhere. You have to generate understanding. This is where an account of explanation needs to be slotted in, I think. And I'm going to do so, but it's going to be very quick. So I embrace a broadly causal approach to explanation, according to which explaining requires depicting a causal pattern. The causal pattern must account for the explanandum. So depicting a causal pattern is depicting features of the system that give rise to the behavior to be explained. Two ingredients are hidden in there. First of all, the pattern must be embodied by the phenomenon in question. Roughly, the causal claims have to be true. Now, not exhaustive. You don't have to have all of the true claims, but you need to have true causal claims about one part of the story. And second, the pattern must match the explanandum, what I have called elsewhere the condition of explanatory adequacy, which is roughly just the idea that what the pattern would lead us to expect, the causal pattern, must more or less have occurred. And just as important as this match with the object of explanation is a match with the subject or subjects of explanation. So the depicted causal pattern also must address the cognitive needs of those seeking explanation. So again, this is just sort of quick claims about what would be required here. I'm slotting in a whole account of explanation without really doing anything to motivate it for you. It's an important part of the story at this point, though. So let's go back to our simple ideal gas law example to show what these requirements amount to at least sort of make it so that you can sort of understand what I'm saying, even though I'm not telling you enough to convince you that this is the right story here. The ideal gas law succeeds as an explanation of the pressure in a balloon doubling when the volume was cut in half, right? This is the same sort of explanation that we talked about before, when I'm just going to walk through how the ideal gas law explanation satisfies these different requirements. When, first of all of its posits are epistemically acceptable. So for example, the claim of the inverse relationship between pressure and volume must be roughly true of the real gas that we're explaining the behavior of. And the idealization of no intermolecular forces must not interfere with the approximate truth of that claim. So that's sort of a quick walk through how the epistemic acceptability of posits works for this idealization versus this claim of fact. Second, the ideal gas law applies to this balloon with its volume halved. That is, the posited relationship between pressure and volume must be roughly true, and this must account for the pressure roughly doubling. The sort of causal facts have to be right. Third, just as importantly, this causal pattern must address the explanation seeker's cognitive needs. So for example, someone with a rough understanding of the relevant physics, but who's forgotten the exact relationship between pressure and volume, or what other variables like temperature that relationship depends on. This doesn't work as an explanation for someone who well remembers the ideal gas law and how it applies here, but who thought that the temperature had simultaneously increased to an extent that the balloon's pressure would have caused it to pop. That requires a different explanation featuring a different causal pattern, indicating different causal influences to explain. Now, the part of the story that's missing that would generate understanding for our imagined subject is a story about the temperature. What happened to the temperature that was contrary to what was expected? So this briefly illustrates what I take to be the epistemic requirements on a successful explanation. I should point out that I actually think you get the epistemic acceptability of posits for free from the requirements of the explanation as a whole. But it doesn't hurt to additionally specify that requirement to sort of point out that you do have this requirement of epistemic acceptability on individual posits in the explanation. Okay. This is a good point in the talk to indicate how this accommodates the points that I've made about rejecting Veritism. Recall the nature of my rejection of Veritism about scientific understanding, what it amounted to for an explanation as a whole and for individual posits. So here's the alternative epistemic standard for successful explanation. instead of for y an explanation of x, instead of y needing to be entirely true of the system in question, for y to explain x, y must depict one causal pattern embodied by the system or systems in question, and that causal pattern must satisfy explanation seekers' cognitive needs. Note that being indexed to explanation seekers' cognitive needs is necessary given the abandonment of a truth requirement. On this view, more causal information is not always or even usually better for understanding. When it comes to individual posits, then, this makes clear how idealizations can be a crucial part of the best explanation. As a consequence, an acceptable idealization or other posit for one specific aim may be unacceptable for a different aim. If we give up the idea that more causal information makes for a better explanation, then we need to accommodate a variety of explanations, each tailored to different cognitive needs. And this variety of explanations means that even idealizations of causal difference makers can be epistemically acceptable, so long as those causes are incidental to explanation seekers' immediate interests. So that's the picture. So I've told you sort of why I reject Veritism, and now I've, on this right-hand side of the slide, presented the alternative picture of how we can still have an objective epistemic standard for scientific understanding, even with a rejection of Veritism, of truth, as the basis for that standard. So I've indicated the reasons why I'm not a veritist, and I've outlined an alternative epistemic standard for successful explanations or successful scientific understanding. In the time I have left, brief time I have left, I want to convince you that this alternative epistemic standard better accommodates the nature of our present-day scientific understanding and provides a natural interpretation of the idea that there is cumulative scientific progress. So this is you can think of this as an independent reason, I think, to embrace non-factivism about understanding and put in different terms, to reject Veritism about understanding. So first up, the nature of our present-day scientific understanding. Here are two ideas about our scientific explanations that follow from what I have said. Oh, if my slide will, sorry, there we go. My slide will obey my instructions here. So first of all, different specific aims of understanding on my account lead to focus on different causal patterns and thus occasion different treatments of the same phenomenon. And second, science doesn't generate unified understanding of a domain, but different non-competing varieties of understanding. Again, these are just two implications of the view of scientific understanding that I have motivated so far in this talk. Here's an example of how this plays out in one scientific investigation. This example is inspired by research in Renee Duckworth's lab at Arizona State University on Western bluebirds' dispersal patterns. Even in a single lab, conducting research focused on a single species on the Western bluebird, researchers do not create an integrated account of the bird's behavior, of why Western bluebirds' range follows forest fires. Rather, they work to uncover various different causal patterns that separately generate understanding, responses to calls for explanation that are occasioned by different research programs in biology. So for example, an interest in species range, this is in the sort of top box that you see here, leads researchers to focus on how the Western bluebird displaces mountain bluebirds from their post-fire colonization. This is one explanation for why the Western bluebird's range follows forest fires, is that they're a post-fire colonizer, not in that initial round, but rather they sort of swoop in on the tail of a different bluebird species and displaces that other species. And then in contrast, an interest in frequency-dependent behavior in behavioral ecology will lead to an explanation for the Western bluebird's range following forest fires that features different sorts of causes entirely. In this case, there's going to be a story to tell about how, for the Western bluebirds, aggressive males are the ones who colonize, and non-aggressive males stay in their current distribution area. So there's a story to tell about how the change in frequency of non-aggressive and aggressive males over time leads to the population of Western bluebirds either staying or migrating in on the heels of mountain bluebirds. Third, if our researchers are focused on epigenetic contributions to inheritance, so how gene influences are mediated by development in animals or organisms in general, there's a different story to tell here still. In this case, there's a story to tell about a maternal effect that we see in the Western bluebirds, where female Western bluebirds that lay eggs are able to vary levels of testosterone in the eggs that in a way that is responsible for when a male Western bluebird is developing in the egg, giving rise to either more aggressive males or less aggressive males. And so there's this role in the maternal effect modulating the behavior and ultimately modulating when and where and to what extent Western bluebirds migrate. So these are supposed to be an example demonstrating how these interests in different types of causal factors will give rise to very different types of explanations for the very same sort of call for explanation. I think they can all plausibly be construed as different explanations for why the Western bluebird's range follows forest fires, and different explanations that, that feature different causal patterns. And as you'd expect, these separate accounts of the Western bluebird require different simplifying assumptions, idealizations that would be epistemically unacceptable for the other accounts. So here's a sort of quick indication of the different types of idealizations that you would get for these different styles of explanation. For the sake of time, I'm not going to walk through them. This example is schematic, admittedly, and my list of idealizations just touches the surface of the idealizations that are useful in these different research programs. But hopefully, my hope here is that this illustrates how different specific aims of understanding occasion different treatments of the same phenomenon, in turn leading to different idealizations being appropriate. Ultimately, my claim is that this characterization of explanation and understanding, right, the sort of the non-factivist picture that I've generated in this talk, makes sense of the division of labor that we see in science better than Veritism does. So this sort of form of rejecting Veritism is a way of making sense of the variability in scientific projects that we actually see, I think, in science. And finally, I said that I would say briefly anyway, how this account of scientific understanding suggests what I think is a quite natural and encouraging view of scientific progress. If we're Veritists, then we must conclude that science has fallen short again and again. And in general, theory change doesn't seem to be getting us closer to the truth. There are many superseded scientific theories that posit radically different views of the world. They must then have been radically wrong. The Earth can't be both the stationary center of the universe and also revolve around the sun. And so we face the problem of the pessimistic meta-induction. Why think our current scientific accounts are true when their many predecessors were not? So this is one of the main challenges in thinking about scientific progress. If, in contrast, the standard for epistemic success is less closely tied to truth and is variable with specific aim, then the outlook, I think, is rosier. Taking our scientific achievements to be understanding based in one among many causal patterns enables, I think, a subtler accounting of what those achievements have had right. Of course, and this includes past scientific achievements as well. Of course, some scientific conjectures are simply wrong. They posit causal patterns that don't exist. But science arguably has latched on to some of the many causal patterns embodied in phenomena of interest. Many previously accepted theories captured causal patterns that are embodied in phenomena, even if they were later replaced by other theories that depicted other patterns, including sometimes more refined relatives of the original pattern. So going back to the closed orbit theory of ionization that I briefly used as an example earlier, this posits classical electron orbits because these capture something crucial about ionization patterns, even though they'd been rejected as false. Indeed, Elisa Bakalich has outlined a number of ways in her work in which classical mechanics lives on despite the theory's rejection. The epistemic standard for understanding that I've motivated in this talk enables this and many other episodes of scientific change to be interpreted in a more cumulative way. In the same way, I think we can be confident of our present science's epistemic success. Our current best theories are probably not true. Some of our current best theories even contradict one another. All of these theories, along with many other kinds of scientific accounts, models, etc., stand a good chance of being jettisoned or significantly altered sometime in the future. But even if that comes to pass, it does not necessarily undermine their contribution to human understanding. If humans now use these products to grasp real causal patterns in the world, then it does not matter if they aren't true. Science is always in revision. That seems like a good starting view of science to take on. But along the way, it is amassing ever more understanding. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was a wonderful talk, very clear and really insightful. I'm sure our participants have a lot to ask and talk about. So yeah, if you have any questions, any thoughts that you'd like to share with our speaker, please raise your hand on Zoom. I'll come to you in the order in which I see your hands raised. Also, I don't know if there's anyone watching us on YouTube, but if there is someone and you'd like us to, sorry about that, background. If there is someone and you'd like us to answer your questions, you can type your questions into the chat there, and maybe one of my co-hosts can just keep an eye on the chat and post the questions in our Zoom chat, so I can get to those as well. All right, Tarun, do you want to start?
Thank you for the talk, Professor. So I think the topics you touched on are extremely significant to the scientific enterprise. I think the scientific enterprise rests on the issues that you covered in your talk, because scientists have to decide whether they should lean towards Veritism or towards the non-factive understanding stance that you defended in your talk. So my question is pretty straightforward, which is, why isn't complete truth required in an explanation? I mean, why isn't complete truth necessary in an explanation? Is this a stance saying that it's fine if scientific explanation works this way, and if science progresses this way, where explanations are not fully true? To me, it seems like one of many positions that one can take here. What do you think of that?
Thanks for the question. So part of my answer is going to be to maybe dispute to some extent the claim that you made first. So I agree that there are implications for scientific practice of whether you're a veritist about explanation and understanding or not. But I don't actually know that we need to that our scientists need to get clear on that sort of before they can get started on their work. And in fact, I think one of the big motivations for the non-factivist view that I endorse is looking at how scientists proceed with explanatory projects and sort of noting, right, making a list of the idealizations that I think you see across different fields of science in these sorts of projects, and then taking very seriously what role those idealizations are playing in the project. And to some extent, I feel like that story won't be a surprise to the scientists whose work I'm thinking about, and they won't say, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize I had let something false, let a false positive into my account." I think sort of, and similarly, the philosophers of science who endorse Veritism aren't going to say, "Oh, I didn't know that they were idealizing," right? I think we all kind of agree about sort of the nature of the accounts that are being put together. But what I take myself to be doing is take very seriously the role of the false posits and try to make sense of what weight those are carrying in science. And that's something that I think pushes us towards non-factivism about scientific understanding in particular, right? That when we look for accounts in science that are designed to generate understanding, there's, I think, a really substantial role played by the false assumptions in connecting to the human intellects that are trying to understand, that are seeking understanding. So let me try to summarize that again. So I take myself not to be saying something radical that will sort of like, if too many scientists hear my talk, they'll say, oh, forget it, I've been doing this all wrong. I don't need to worry about truth anymore. But I think it sort of is a way of accounting for features that scientific accounts that generate understanding already have. And I think sort of carrying through, this part is debatable, but I think sort of carrying through pretty natural implications of the epistemic importance of those false assumptions. I hope that connects with your question.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
Thanks, Tarun. Tushar?
I have a couple of maybe contradictory questions, but because I want to understand this topic better. So first question is that in the traditional accounts of the knowledge condition, which is truth belief, I really do not understand that whether they satisfy the truth condition. So if somebody says that X believes that P, and P is that he has a round ball, and when he goes, closely observes the roundness, it's not, perfectly round. So even that claim is not perfectly true. So isn't the traditional account of epistemic success suffering from the same problem which non-factive is trying to defend? The second thing is that if we relegate veritism, then how do we differentiate between the causal patterns and epiphenomenal patterns? Because epiphenomenal patterns will be, in some case, maybe satisfying the conditions of epistemic acceptability, adequacy, and success. And third is, can't we have a middle path? Because partial truth in a non-factive account doesn't necessarily lead to complete false in an epistemic or veridical sense. So we can, rephrase it as an instrumentally epistemically required thing, So we can have the veridical claim by providing this partial factivist claim, to our truth conditions.
Thank you. So you might have to remind me along the way, because those are three really, really good questions on three totally different things. I think I've already forgotten the second. So you might have to remind me, just nudge me a bit on what to respond to along the way. But first you asked about scientific knowledge, and you're absolutely right that this complicates that, right? So if I'm going around making a big deal about how scientific explanations, the vehicles for our scientific understanding, fall short of truth, then it seems like I might have to give up on the idea of that they get us scientific knowledge, because it seems like you need to have sort of truth in order to get knowledge. So I do have in mind, I haven't talked about this today at all, but I do have in mind a sort of maneuver around that. And this is something I've been working on, sort of working out more fully a bit recently. So there is a preprint online if you're interested in reading more about it. But so I am a scientific realist in the sense that I think science generates legitimate knowledge. But I have in mind like a two-step move. So I think that if you think about what science is generating understanding of, sort of the engine of science is all of these phenomena in the world that we seek to understand, right? The Western bluebird's dispersal pattern, for example. And I think that what science does is get us non-factive understanding of all of these phenomena that are under investigation. And so what scientific knowledge consists in, I think, in these cases, is knowledge of causal patterns. And so this is the sort of division that I want to make. So scientific research is occasioned by all of these phenomena. We're understanding these phenomena, the real gases, the dispersal patterns of Western bluebirds, et cetera. But the knowledge that we're generating isn't strictly speaking knowledge of those phenomena, but sort of one step removed from that. It's knowledge of causal patterns, some of the causal patterns, not even all of them usually, that those phenomena embody. So that's what I want to say about scientific knowledge. What was your second question?
So second question was, by lowering the bar, in a sense, or relegating veritism, can't we confuse causal patterns with
Oh, good.
epiphenomenal patterns?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the reminder. Yes, another good question. So there is a worry that sort of, if you really get to the bottom of things and require complete truth and all of the truth, then you sort of can't be led astray by what look like patterns, but turn out to be, as you say, epiphenomenal, sort of not actually causally productive or sort of only apparent. So I do think there's an answer there too. But again, it's something that I haven't talked at all about in this talk. What I would want to plug in there is Jim Woodward's account of causation in particular. And that is a manipulability account, a variety of a counterfactual account of causation, where I think it's very common. It's sort of based on sort of all of these practices in science, that is Woodward's account is. And I think that causal analysis, we can talk about the sort of ideal potential intervention where you change the value of one variable, hold everything not on that path constant, and see whether the other variable changes in response over some range of conditions, right? And so I think that is what I've said in my book. So I take that on board as a sort of assumption of how of what causation amounts to as an analysis of causation in my idealization book, but sort of acknowledge that I'm not giving an independent defense of that way of starting. But I do say there that, and I think this is right, that I think that way of reasoning about causation is epistemically basic in the way of like, that's kind of how we as scientists and people have to get started in thinking about causal relationships. That was probably too much detail, but what I want to say then is that thinking about causation in that way, in this sort of fundamentalist, right, there's a way, this opens up a way of thinking about causation that doesn't require thinking about individual pushes between individual particles or anything like that. And so it gives us access for a way of determining when we have legitimate causation, and thus, in my view, legitimate causal patterns, even without sort of trying to give a full account of what's going on, right? So to put it in terms common in other parts of philosophy of science, we don't necessarily, I think, have to find the mechanism in order to know that there's a causal relationship, as long as we're in the right position to do these sorts of, tests or investigations that approximate an ideal intervention and can give us kind of direct insight into the counterfactual relationship in those cases. One other thing that I want to say there too is that the account that I'm picturing, I made a big deal in the account that I'm trying to put together of non-factivism in this talk about the sort of variable truth conditions by different posits in an explanation, right? So I don't want to say that sort of for any individual claim in an explanation, they don't have to be exactly true. Some claims, based on the sort of weight that they carry in a scientific account and sort of how they are, the epistemic attitude that our scientists take towards those claims, right? Namely, when our scientists put forward as true certain claims, those better be true. So some claims have to be true, right? Even in my account. It's just that not all posits that contribute epistemically to the explanation are supposed to be true. Right? We have all of these idealizations and other sort of and other potential posits that our scientists don't take to be true, don't posit as true, that are doing a different kind of work that's nonetheless less epistemically significant. So I wanted to sort of emphasize that part in response to your question as well, since I take it that part of the worry about these sort of only apparent patterns is that, well, if you're not requiring truth, then you just kind of get to squint and accept lots of things that doesn't seem like they're actually important or actually legitimate, something like that. All right, I'm sorry, that was too long of an answer. So would you remind me of your third question really quickly?
The third question was actually, can we not treat non-factive claims as some kind of epistemic instruments towards, the traditional epistemic truth conditions?
I thought I understood the question first time through, but I'm less confident now. Could you say a bit more?
So we don't need to necessarily discard, Veritism. We can have the traditional notions of epistemic success and what we already have to believe, but treat non-factive claims, as some kind of instruments towards, approaching towards the actual truths.
Okay. Yeah. So here too, I want to appeal to what at least I think I see in scientific practices and in the directions that science is heading. So I do think that's a view that you could take, something like, temporarily for now, our scientists accept less than 100% truth in their accounts, but as truer accounts become available, science will move to embrace those accounts versus others. I don't think that's what we see. So going back to the sort of ideal gas law example, we have a more accurate account available, at least one, and I take it others as well, in van der Waals equations. And ideal gas law is still important, is still regularly taught to new scientists and used in a variety of, I think, epistemically valuable ways, despite being less accurate than an alternative that we have at our disposal. And I think you see the same things in different fields where, so here's maybe an example from biology. There's a lot of really interesting work on the extended evolutionary synthesis, right? And getting away from sort of assumptions that evolution is the only important driving force in biological outcomes. And that's really important, interesting work, but it's not, the extended synthesis folks would like that to be maybe all of the work being done in biology now. But that's only one sort of strand of research. There are all these other researchers who are still focused in on evolution and factors relevant to evolution. So there too, I think you sort of, even as more comprehensive accounts become available, what we see in science, I think, is not those more comprehensive, more accurate accounts replacing the earlier ones, right? The more partial accounts, but sort of all of these different approaches being employed across a field and put to different purposes in such a way that I think it supports this idea that that understanding can be this sort of partial perspectival achievement that doesn't sort of end the story, right? But sort of gives us one bit of insight where other scientists seeking other sorts of insight will be doing other projects, something like that.
Yeah. So that leads to a follow-up question. Can I ask that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
So with respect to competing idealization, so you talked about van der Waals correction. So van der Waals correction actually follows from the ideal gas law, but there is another competing idealization of virial expansion, virial series, which is derived from the statistical model. So that leads to a normative question. Among the various idealized claims, what should be the non-factive claim that we should proceed with?
What should the non-factive what? Sorry, I missed the last part.
What should be the normative criteria among the competing idealization?
Yeah. So this is where I really want to emphasize. I mean, I also think this is a strength of the sort of account that I'm trying to develop. I want to emphasize that that question is in part answered by the scientist's purposes, right? Like what is the aim? Is the aim to get a broad characterization of the relationship between the interrelationship between pressure, temperature, and volume? Or are we interested in how real gases deviate from ideal gases, right? Or how two real gases respond in slightly different ways? And sort of those questions are going, or the answers to those questions are going to influence whether we want, let me put it a different way, what exact idealizations are appropriate, right? So this kind of was something that I talked about when I was talking about the conditions for epistemic acceptability in that condition B that I think is so important. We have to first ask about what scientists want to do with their account, and that will vary, right? In these sort of hard to track ways where we really need to attend to the details, I think. And then at that point, when we know what the goal is, we can sort of make sense of what features of a system are idealized and which ones they try to get maximally accurate and which ones are sort of somewhat idealized, but somewhat represented vertically, et cetera.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.
Thanks, Tushar. Wasim?
Oh, hi. So I have 3 questions. Should I ask them at one go or one by one?
Well, I think we just determined that I'm not good at keeping them all in my head. So maybe one by one.
All right. All right. So the first question is regarding the generic epistemic acceptability. You said that a posit is epistemically acceptable if the divergence from the truth is quite significant. And you gave 2 examples of 2 examples, which one was the ideal case example, and the other was how classical physics is applied to the modern to the atomic model, right? So but in both of these cases, the truth of the matter was already established, right? I mean, we knew that we know that even if you apply the classical model, we know that this is not the case, but we can still somehow work out the problems, and that is serve a purpose. But what if the truth of the matter is not established already? In that case,
Yeah, so things can be a lot muddier, right? So I take it if sort of we're in this pre-quantum world and we don't yet know whether we can trust classical mechanics, then we might not be in the position to ascertain or to accurately ascertain whether positing closed orbits is epistemically acceptable or not. So there's another example. So biology is my sort of home turf. It's where I'm more comfortable with the science. And there's an example in evolutionary biology that I like of this, where it's not as if scientists, when they first started sort of working through their models of selection, right, or the Hardy-Weinberg equation, et cetera, and wrote down the assumptions, because there were assumptions then too. The population is infinite in size wasn't written down as an assumption. It wasn't known that was a necessary assumption to the account, right? And it's only as things develop and Kimura determined that we can have this influence of chance based on all of these different potential influences, that right, the importance of genetic drift was acknowledged. And then at that point, I think it's telling that at least biologists, so some biologists then sort of started working on genetic drift and making sense of that. But others who were sort of building, population genetic models and evolutionary ecology models of the ecological source of selection and things like that, didn't say, oh gosh, we got to give up these approaches. They said, aha, so we're also assuming that the population is infinite in size. We didn't write that assumption down before, but now we know that that's an assumption of our approaches too, right? Here's how we can ignore this thing that you just discovered over there, something like that. So I think you're absolutely right. So there's, even if I can sort of write down what governs in a generic way, what governs epistemic acceptability, there's a big question of how scientists get to the point of being able to judge for any given posit that it is epistemically acceptable or not. Notice also that's sort of a nice feature, I think, of the variability. For idealizations, once you know to formulate the idealization, there's basically, nothing that you need to do to justify it, but there's very little given the sort of epistemic acceptability requirement, how that works for idealizations. There's very little that needs to be done to justify that in general, whereas there's a much higher bar and it's much harder to ascertain for claims posited as true.
And a small question, just follow up to the first question. So what degree of insignificance is acceptable? It's just quite unclear, and should we care about this? So, yeah, am I making sense?
Sorry, no, I need that one more time. Sorry.
Yeah. So, what degree of insignificance is acceptable?
Yeah. It varies. I mean, that's what's sort of carrying all of the weight with this epistemic acceptability requirement, right? Is the rules are set by whether a posit is claimed to be true, or I keep saying something in between idealizations and true claims. I do think that there are things in that zone. I'll try to give sort of an illustration of that. So claimed to be true, right? Then there's no deviation from the truth that's possible. As soon as some scientists uncovers that there's evidence that claim is not true, then we're in trouble. We need to edit that claim, edit the accounts accordingly. Sometimes there are parameters that are introduced as sort of good enough, even if not exactly accurate. And in that case, let's say that there's sort of a finer value determined. Well, as long as the parameter still works well enough for the purpose to which the representation is put, then I predict our scientists won't worry about it and won't say, well, we can refine that parameter. They'll say, well, ours works fine. It's close enough to what we have or whatever.
The second question is on the current scientific understanding. You said that science that does not generate unified understanding. Rather, it generates varieties of understanding. So I'm wondering, how are these? So I'm assuming that it's talking about a particular phenomenon, having multiple understanding about a particular phenomenon, right? So how are these multitude of understanding related? And if they are related, what are the features that are what are the relations between these amongst these varieties of understanding? And if they are not related, then what does it mean to be then this entails that I think it seems to me that to understand, we are not really understanding a phenomena, we are just understanding an explanation of that phenomenon. Because
good.
Right.
So how are these different accounts related to one another? This is one of the sort of questions that has really motivated just all of my research, like since my dissertation, a couple of decades ago on, because I think it's really sort of a surprising and confusing aspect of at least the kind of science that I know the most about, that you have these different accounts that are provided from different theoretical perspectives of really closely related and sometimes the very same phenomena. And so that's been sort of this motivating puzzle for me over the years. And so what I would want to say is science generates, and I think actually this is pretty easy to demonstrate from examples in science. I think science generates multiple different accounts of the very same phenomena, and that those different accounts capture different causal patterns is what I want to say. So more generically, you could say, feature different causal information about the phenomenon in question. So going back to biology again, our population genetics models capture changes in gene frequency over generations. So it's sort of shorter time span and focus on genes. Our evolutionary ecology models, like game theory models, capture ecological sources of selection and tend to be longer term evolutionary models. So I think that there are things to say about the orientation based on of these approaches and what approach they take to particular phenomena, such that like once you get into the details, it's sort of not that surprising and startling that we have different accounts of the very same things, if that makes sense. And there was a second question in there at the end. I'm trying to remember what you asked at the end about it. Why would we say that this is and gives us understanding of the phenomena itself versus just like, one slice of it? I forget how you put it, but like understanding of it, an explanation for it or whatever. And that's a good question. And I think I would retreat to the fact that when I look at the relationship that these different scientific accounts bear to one another, I don't see a lot of energy put into integrating different accounts by and large. And I think there are exceptions to that, but I think that they're the sort of exceptions that prove the rule. And so why say that, the ideal gas law just gives understanding of this instance of me squeezing the balloon, right? And how that increases the pressure in the balloon versus just one narrow slice in it. And I think that's a natural thing to say, that what you're explaining, what you're getting understanding of is the phenomenon itself, because I think that understanding is a cognitive achievement that relates not only to the world and facts about the world, but also to us as cognizers, and sort of makes that sort of connection in an effective way, such that we understand something about the world. And I think that taking seriously the way that understanding is indexed to our cognition and our interests, et cetera, leads quite naturally to a sort of view where what questions I have, or we sort of explanatory audience, what questions we have about the phenomena, that addressing those just is generating understanding of the phenomenon. So I said two different things and I kind of rambled. So I'm going to try to say very briefly those two things again. So I think that part of the answer is that it's okay to have a kind of index to particular questions about the phenomenon feature of understanding and explanation, because understanding and explanation is about us as knowers. And the first thing that I said before that is another reason that I think we should just say that these partial accounts generate understanding of the phenomena, full stop, is that you by and large don't see, I think, in science an attempt to get, what some of philosophers have called like an objectual understanding of a given phenomenon, get all of the different pieces on the table at once and make sense of all of the features. And I think that there are good things to say about why that's by and large not a focus in science.
So the third question is on, you said one of the features of a successful explanation is that it fulfills the needs of the seeker, right? So I think this makes an explanation quite the subject centered, as in like agenda dependent, when very kind of not very objective in my opinion. So then so my question is, since explanation, I mean, this makes explanation very agent dependent. What? Sorry, I forgot my question.
Okay, see, we can come back to it.
Okay, I'll come back later. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
No worries.
I forgot. Thank you.
Siddhant?
Hi. So I wanted to ask, now we are saying that the posits that we are using in the idealizations are, scientists make use of causal patterns and how they, what kind of roles do they perform in certain causal patterns. But I want to hear your views whether on cases where the explanations are not exactly causal. So if regarding non-causal explanations, and what are your views about that?
Thanks. Yeah. So there are different types of non-causal explanations, I think, that have been motivated by different philosophers of science. And some of those I'm suspicious of, and others of those I think are probably right. So there's one style of arguing for non-causal explanation that says something like, well, our representation isn't veridical enough. It doesn't seem true enough to actually be causal. So, but it's still an explanation. So this is Elisa Bakulich, is someone who has this kind of an argument. As you might predict from what I've said, I don't think that shouldn't be an argument. I think that the explanation is non-causal. I think there's a story to tell then about the parts about the degrees and respects in which the explanation is accurate versus inaccurate. And we can assess the explanation to see whether it counts as epistemically acceptable and successful. But I don't think that that's an argument for a different kind of explanation that's non-causal, that you're sort of not accurately enough portraying the causes. So I don't find that sort of non-causal explanation argument compelling. There's another kind of argument that focuses on the role that constitutive relationships, for example, can play in explanation, and I think closely related arguments for the sort of a distinctive role for mathematical relationships to play in explanation. And I suspect both of those are types of dependence that can be explanatory. So I find that sort of more compelling. So I count myself as among the sort of many philosophers of science who I'm comfortable talking about sort of explanations as capturing dependence relations in the world. So that would be the sort of way to broaden out my emphasis on causal explanation and causal pattern explanation, is that you can also talk about patterns and other forms of dependence like constitution and mathematical dependence. An interesting thing is that often or always, I think, when you see depictions of constitutive or mathematical relationships, I think there is also causal content there. And I know advocates of non-causal explanations sort of have arguments for why those shouldn't just be considered causal explanations. And I don't really have anything, I don't have a view on that. I think it's fine to talk about, to note, and probably important to note, other forms of dependence that are also explanatory, and the contributions that constitutive relationships, that depicting constitutive relationships and mathematical relationships can make to human understanding. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Siddhant. Anatoly?
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I hope I didn't miss that. My question is, how do you position yourself in respect to fictionalist account of scientific representations, and in the light of your idea of understanding and how it is tailored to us as a things that are trying to know? What do you think the role of imagination in that?
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean about fictionalism, so that I know how to answer? Because
what I mean by fictionalism is that so some philosophers started talking, I think including you, started talking about the fact that scientific representations are not representing anything actual, and because they idealize and because they simplify, and then there was this transition towards thinking of scientific representations and models, for example, as fictions, and it depends. There are different things that then people start developing out of it, but I think one of those is talking about the role of imagination in learning from idealized representations or idealized models.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, one thing that I really like about the emphasis of taking seriously the respects in which scientific models fictionalize scenarios is, I think that's a nice way, and this I think captures or gets at what you were after with pointing to the role of imagination. I think that way of speaking is a nice way of getting at this idea that idealizations, so the false posits themselves again, the idea that a population is infinite, right, that gases have these different properties that they don't have, that those are doing something positive, right? So there's another view of idealization that sort of, I think Michael Strevens has this kind of a view, for example, that is sort of that idealizations are a way of kind of setting aside things and, sort of clearing the floor for the parts of the story that we are giving. But I find compelling this idea that there is sort of, first of all, a positive epistemic contribution to idealizations, which is what I focused on in this talk, but then also sort of that idealizations play a positive part of the account, even as and because of their difference from the phenomenon under investigation. So what I would want to say, and so I like fictionalizing as a sort of way of it's an evocative way of kind of, I think, making that point that there's something positive being done here by the idealizations. The thing that I like to say is that the sort of positive role and positive epistemic role of the misrepresentation of idealizations in these kind of explanatory uses anyway, consists in gaining additional accuracy, we might say, of the causal pattern of interest, right? So there's a way in which assuming the gas is ideal is inaccurate of any gas that we're interested in explaining, but it is a way of really letting the ideal gas law zero in on the sort of purest form of that pattern, right? What it would take, what the world would need to be like in order for that pattern to not just be a pattern that's embodied by our systems, but to actually sort of exist in its own right, something like that. Yeah, so the role of imagination, I guess the only thing I'd add to that, to what I just said, is that, again, going back to sort of the extent to which the human explainers, I think, get to set the rules by focusing in on which causes they're interested in, means that that sort of what I just said about the positive epistemic contributions of idealization is sort of interest relative in a way that we wouldn't say claims about phenomena are, something like that, that there's some sort of setting the rules by the explainers that is featuring into this use of idealizations. I should also say, I think that there's probably a lot more to say about the role, and that is being said right now, about the role of fiction in generating understanding, and the role more broadly of imagination in science that I haven't touched on either here or in my work. So there's a lot more to say that I'm not able to say, but that's maybe how the things that I do think about make contact with those ideas.
Okay, thank you. Jubair?
Thank you very much for the lecture, Professor. My question is regarding, I mean, as you said about models have this non-factive component, and I was like reading how Elgin was giving an example of a sample of paint to explain like an epistemic access to understand, and like I mean, he correlated it with ideal gas law. But like let's compare it with the computer simulations. I mean, they're also a kind of idealized model with more addition of information or data. So if I simulate computationally a behavior of gas, which is non-ideal, and when it gets simulated, I understand it how the gas will be behaving, perhaps in more richer way. Would it be like this computer simulation model would be more factual in compared to this classical understanding of what models do or idealization?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what I would want to say is, if we sort of roll up our sleeves and sort of get serious about what the computer simulation is accurately representing versus what, say, a mathematical model of the same phenomenon is mathematically representing. So the sort of to paint a picture of when we might have these two different approaches to the same phenomenon, what comes to my mind immediately is sort of evolving dynamics that you might get with the iterated prisoner's dilemma, right? So you can have a mathematical model of the prisoner's dilemma that you use as a basis for studying the iterated prisoner's dilemma, or you can have a computer model of different strategies playing each other over time. So that's maybe sort of a quick illustration of when you might have both a computer model and a mathematical model. So your question is the computer model sort of more veritist, right? Can we say that it's sort of the explanation that we get from the computer model, I guess, because the idealizations are sort of filled in with more realistic details? Is it more true, something like that? What I would want to emphasize, so I do think sometimes you get a relationship between different accounts of the same phenomenon that are, strictly speaking, sort of more accurate and less accurate. So I think that's the case with the ideal gas law and van der Waals equation. But so often, I think instead what you get are accounts that are differently accurate. And so I think if we sort of looked at our computer model, computer simulation next to our mathematical model, we'd find that there are certain sort of, claims made on the basis of the mathematical model that get certain features of the scenario very nicely right. And other sort of more accurate assumptions may be built in as starting points of the computer simulation, but then other features of the scenario that are less accurate. So I probably won't be able to make good on that, illustrating that with my example on the fly, but I could switch examples again and try to do it. But to try to summarize what I'm saying, I do think on occasion you get more accurate and less accurate accounts. I think more often what we see, if we look carefully at the claims that are made and the other posits, such as facilitating idealizations that are made in the background or explicitly, a lot of times what we see are accounts that get different features of the scenario accurate, right? So are accurate in different respects. And that fits really nicely with this story that I want to tell about a sort of continuing plurality of scientific accounts of something that sometimes we'll want to grab the computer simulation of the iterated prisoner's dilemma for certain purposes, and other times the sort of analytic mathematical account of the prisoner's dilemma is going to do better for us, something like that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Anyone else want to ask something among the participants, or potentially even non-participants at the stage? Yeah, Abhishek, yeah, go ahead.
I probably have I have two questions, and maybe they're related, but I can't really pin down the connection between them. But maybe one could just be a hard-hit Veritistic at this point and say that we don't really need to grant all these idealizations of posits, as you're calling, as true. For example, one could say that, and this would also probably sit closer to the selective accounts of realism, and also probably how scientists reason about these things. Maybe in this context, maybe in the context of, let's say, when we are talking about very low pressure helium, the ideal gas equation would be accurate. But when you talk about real gases, then it won't be. Then we need to introduce corrections. So maybe one could simply be a hard Veritistic and say that we really don't need to grant truth to these posits for us to gain understanding. One need not, for example, go for a non-factive account of understanding. Simply say that in order to gain genuine understanding, we need to talk about the best theories that we can marshal.
Yeah. So I think what's difficult about that view is that at least in some fields of science, maybe just across the board, I don't think that's what we see being done. I think one thing that's really interesting about explanation and understanding as a place to think about the contributions of idealizations is that I think anyway, what we see in science is explanatory value is implicitly taken to be sort of value to our cognition, our cognitive access to the scenario, such that we can make sense of the long-term value of false assumptions, simplifying assumptions. So I think we still explain with the ideal gas law. We still explain with population genetic models of evolution, despite knowing that they're overly simplified. And so I guess something to say there more broadly is that if one thinks that there is an explanatory role for models in general in science, which again is something that's gotten a lot of attention by philosophers of science, and sure seems like scientists explain with models, then that in itself puts pressure on the idea that accounts have to be true in order to explain, because one of the sort of starting rules of scientific modeling is that you don't have to have complete truth, right? There was something else I was going to say here. that might help with another sort of angle of the concern, and I'm losing track of it. Sorry, I've lost track of the second thing I was going to say. If you have a follow-up, maybe that will prompt it, but no pressure.
No, I mean, think about it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. There was something else I thought that would help respond to maybe part of what was motivating your concern, but I can't. Like I said, I sort of lost it, flew away, and then I couldn't grab it again.
I mean, probably it was something to do with the fact that even most accounts of realism, they don't really apply it across the board. They won't really. I mean, if concern, I mean, if you have to somehow gain genuine understanding in order to be, let's say, a realist about or have an objective account of the world, I mean, even then, we don't really need to be applying this this account of understanding across the board. Right? We could simply say that, okay, if you demand more accuracy, or if you demand application across the board for a particular posit, then you'll have to fall back to the best representation that we currently have. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah, so maybe one other thing I can say quickly is it ties into my response to the question just prior, but I anyway, yeah, I'll set that aside. I remember what I was going to say, but I don't think it's relevant here. But I think that I think kind of uncontroversially, and this gets back to the sort of role of models too in science, I think what we see is scientists preserving many different accounts or several different accounts of the very same phenomena. Sometimes those are the very same scientists doing it, right? Different climate models that are used concurrently. Other times it's different types of scientists developing different types of modeling approaches of the same phenomena. And so given that that's the case, I think there's an uphill battle to argue that a good way of making sense of scientific success is narrowing in on the account that does the work for us, because I just don't think that's what we see. Rather, I think a challenge for anyone who wants to maintain Veritism about explanation and understanding is to make sense of, first of all, at the posit level, the continuing contribution to our explanations of false posits, right? Which people have done a lot of work on. There are definitely things to say there. But then secondly, of the sort of comprehensive accounts of phenomena, why it is that we continue to, that our scientists and audience for science continues to apparently find explanatory value in accounts that are not the most accurate accounts on offer.
Okay, Anatoly, you have another question?
So I have a question. It's a little bit out of complete ignorance, but I'm thinking about models based on machine learning method. And if I understand it right, those type of models are usually quite not only mathematically not tractable, but they're just not transparent at all. And I'm wondering how would it fit the idea of increase of understanding, because it's not clear whether they bring in some kind of understanding. Well, they probably bring some in some way, but in more general sense, it's not clear.
Absolutely. So this is something I don't know a lot about. I don't study machine learning and AI, but I think this is a really natural connection here, and it's one that I'm seeing others make. So there is lots of work on what it would take to produce explainable AI, right? So to have machine learning algorithms that spit out an answer, but then also that spit out an account that we can grasp of how you might think of a path to that answer, which will only loosely, if at all, correspond to the machine learning sort of process that spit out the result, right? I think this is really interesting. And so some of those discussions are then making reference to philosophy of science literature on the nature of scientific explanation. And I think especially ways in which scientific explanations may vary from complete truth. One thing that I think is really interesting about that is it's another context in which it's at least implicitly and often explicitly granted that successful explanations let me put that differently, that explanation success has something to do with making contact with our intellects, right? Which I think is something, it's something that's been said regularly about explanation throughout the, philosophy of science literature and scientific explanation, going back at least to Hempel, where there's this sort of tight relationship posited between explanations and generating understanding. But that connection and what explanations need to do to connect in the right way to human intellects is a feature of explanation that I think we philosophers of science haven't really made good on in sort of featuring in our accounts of explanation historically. And so, yeah, so I think that the connection to machine learning and AI there is really interesting and a sort of nice connection point in sort of reflecting on ways in which, first of all, our science explanation and understanding sort of matter to our science, right? That it's not just about, for example, spitting out predictions, but we have other types of projects in science as well. And second of all, that generating understanding involves more than just sort of conditions on success for accuracy of the world, right? But that there's something that needs to be said there about how some account needs to connect to us, to our intellects, in order for it to be an adequate explanation.
So those machine learning algorithms need to learn how to produce metaphors so we can understand them.
Yeah, exactly. It's good.
Okay, thanks, Anatoly. Wasim?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll come back to the question that I left halfway, which was on an explanation being a successful one. So one of the conditions for an explanation to be a successful explanation is that it must fulfill the needs of the seeker. And I said that it makes an explanation very agent dependent. I think the capacity of grasping an explanation differs from individual to individual, and so does the tendency of needs getting fulfilled from seeker to seeker. And I also think that there is no normative way to judge, to what level an explanation is fulfilling the needs of an individual. So, should we consider or think of explanation as an epistemic aim of science, given the relativity, of
Yeah, thank you.
tendency?
Oh, sorry, did I miss something at the end there?
No, yeah, given the the level of relativism exists, in the tendencies of grasping, and
yeah. So I think great question, and I know that that's something that sort of feels uncomfortable and risky about the kind of picture that I'm trying to paint with, for example, what I've said today, and just in the response that I gave to the last question, like, so you're saying explanations are about us, but like, we know that we don't want to just tell stories that sound good to us and then go home for the day. We want to get it right, right? We want our scientists to get it right. And should we really give up on that? So the kind of focus that I had in my talk today on epistemic acceptability, and then more generally building from that to what it takes to have a successful account, a successful explanation of something, that is all supposed to convince people with that kind of a worry, that I'm not saying, oh, just make your audience happy and then go home, right? As long as it's the story they want to hear, then you're good. I think that there are significant requirements for objective requirements for the success of our explanations, the epistemic success of our explanations, that have to do with representation of the world, right? So you have to have accuracy of the world. You do, in certain respects and to certain degrees, but accuracy of the world. That accuracy is also, I think, rightly, of course, because it's my view, but I think it's also not relative, but relational to what questions we're asking about the world in a way that I don't think is sort of super sketchy or anything like that, or risky. So to some extent, our explainers set the rules by what questions they ask. And that's kind of put generically, that's something that philosophers of science and scientists alike have agreed upon for decades or perhaps forever, right? That what scientific questions are posed is this kind of subjective influence on science. But then how the next part of the story, right, is how those questions are answered, though, isn't up to the scientists, right? It's up to the world. Whether your answers are right is up to the world. What sort of accurate answers you can give. So that's a true description of my account too. It's just that I'm emphasizing the great degree of influence that what questions are posed bear on what answers successfully generate understanding. So it's not just a question of whether you're studying evolution or subatomic particles, right? It's a question of whether you're studying evolution with an eye to selection, or with an eye to genetic drift, or with an eye to population genetic change. And there are all of these different, I think, explanatory projects that are really closely related and that target the same phenomena. And so, but I don't think it's a sort of difference in kind from scientists figure out what their question is, and then, the world tells us whether our answers that we generate are right or not. Because once you zero in on specifically, on my account, specifically what style of question you want to ask about this phenomenon, then that hands you what your success conditions are for a successful explanation. And that requires, accuracy of the world in certain respects in order to be met. So hopefully that kind of helps support the idea that you don't have to give up on sort of facts and the importance of capturing reality in order to follow me on these ideas.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Wasim. Okay, so we have, I think, officially gone over the time allocated for this, but there are still a couple of hands up. So, but I don't want to keep you if you have other commitments or something. So do you mind if we take the remaining two questions?
It's fine with me, yes.
Okay, all right, great. Sabhav?
Hello. I just wanted to ask, is there a way for us to reject Veritism like you do in your accounts of explanations, and also to hold a sort of realism about laws and not fall into what Nancy Cartwright does with her rejection of ceteris paribus laws, because and only say that laws only track causal capacities and not really some exceptionless regularities?
So yes and no. So yes is my main answer. I think there is, and it's I think that's so it's on my view, it's causal patterns. I think that we should posit causal patterns as real and the sort of things that are embodied by our phenomena. So there's something that I remember Cartwright saying in the 1983 book so she explores, I'm not going to remember the details, so I probably will be inaccurate in what I say, but she explores whether we couldn't have access to something, something like saying, well, this is getting, this force, this is saying something true of this force, but not how it combines in all these respects. And she says something in passing, like, if there were some role that played, maybe we do that, but it's not a promising sort of, there's no motivation to go that direction. So that's where I part ways with Cartwright, who especially that sort of early Cartwright has been really influential in how I think about all of these things. I think that we have really good grounds for positing the reality of causal patterns, and more broadly, positing the reality of our laws, regularities, general tendencies, et cetera, that our scientific accounts focus on. So I think we can be realist about those things. But then you said something at the end that made me think that you're not going to be totally happy with the way that I'll sort of with the details here, because I do think it turns out to be, given the complexity of our world, it turns out to be a feature of most, if not all, of our laws and accounts more generally, that the patterns that they capture obtain over some limited, sometimes quite broad, but a limited scope of conditions, and have deviations and exceptions. So maybe that's not the case for absolutely every scientific account, but by and large, it seems like that's the way that things are going. So I think that this does give a way to preserve scientific knowledge and emphasize the role of things like scientific laws. But it might be that what I have in mind for scientific laws, you find a bit disappointing, because I think, like I said, I think it makes sense to emphasize that by and large, our scientific accounts feature patterns that hold over some range of conditions, and that in many cases, we can also talk about deviations and exceptions even within that range, something like that.
Okay, thanks. And we will close with a question from Shinod.
Yeah, a wonderful engagement. Thank you. My one question was already answered, so I'll go to the less significant one. It is fascinating in a way that you are proposing a disunity even within a particular domain with respect to explanations as well as understanding, because it is possible to have different models under the same theory, I guess, and each model may or may not account for one causal pattern, but they are useful in a way to give us some account of the causal patterns. Now, what I'm wondering about is that now, which is the door in which the realism is coming to this picture? Because here, the models, when they hatch onto the world, that relation is via their ability to either to predict the quantitative relations or by helping us intervene in the world. But none of this seems to be any kind of guarantee, because we already it has already accepted that we are playing with false models in that sense. So, so it is not clear to me the role you open for realism in this part of the game. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good and challenging question. So I'm going to start by sort of gesturing towards a whole lot of work that we have to do in sort of adequately accounting for science that I'm not doing at all here, which is there are all sorts of stories to tell in what we need to do to justify our accounts in science, right? Our proffered explanations, our models used for a variety of different purposes, et cetera. And I'm not telling any part of that story here. And it's important, right? It's an important part of the story. In general, I don't have a lot to say on that part, but I acknowledge its importance. So what I can say is, as you say, there are different techniques that scientists have at their disposal in order to test proffered accounts, right? In order to test whether their accounts are accurate or not. So I want to emphasize a few things. First of all, as you probably will predict at this point, given what I'm emphasizing in this talk and in our Q&A, I think that the requirements that scientists place on the different posits that comprise their account vary by posit. And so, right, a claim that is a claim that, you know, the system has some given value of this parameter. If we measure it and it turns out to be wrong, we need to change our account, right, and get that parameter right. If though instead we're talking about an idealized assumption, right, that there's no friction, our scientists aren't even going to check probably to see whether there's friction, because we know there's friction. Maybe they'll check depending on the circumstances to see whether the surface we're dealing with doesn't have too much friction, or they'll consciously select a rather low friction surface to work with, something like that. So I think the rules for what testing demands vary by posit. And similarly, and this kind of varies across field too, the extent to which any attention is paid to justifying idealized assumptions. So in some cases, and I think you see this more in biology and social sciences than in physics. But in some cases, scientists just help themselves to idealize assumptions, to idealizations, without even checking to see whether they're like good enough, right? They're sort of starting points, and maybe they're revisited only when they start to cause issues for the overall representation. So that's one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is something that I think, I don't know, I shouldn't introduce this right here at the end. It's going to make you all think I'm even farther out there than you already think I am. But something that I think is an implication of this kind of a view is that, and I'll explain it after I say it, is that the aims of prediction and intervention and explanation pull apart. And so maybe we can actually go back to the machine learning sort of analogy to start to make that point. If we want the absolute best prediction of, whether this patient has cancer, we're just going to go with what the machine learning algorithm spits out, and we're not going to worry about it anymore. We sort of have verified the accuracy of the algorithm. We know that it's better than our human doctors, and we're good. But if we care about the whys, right? If we want to understand how something comes to be, why we might think that the evidence or the conditions lead us to think that there's cancer, et cetera, that's when we need an explanation. And I think that just like we have a trade-off there between explanatory value to us versus predictive value, I think that we see that kind of a trade-off in science as well, where if and when the goals are prediction of one form or another, you have a style of accuracy and de-idealization that's prioritized. And one expense, I think, often is to the explanatory value of the account. So think here about big computer models of climate change in many cases. We might not understand how the physics is brought to bear, but it spits out various answers that are useful in sort of planning. In contrast, when the aim is understanding, I think that sort of zeroing in on specifically what about the situation we want to understand, what causal pattern we want to know about, will, and this is part of the story I've given so far, this part of it, will justify the inclusion of certain styles of idealization to support an account of just that causal pattern. And so what that means, though, I think, is that the overall predictive value and value to intervention, except for in very specific respects, of the resulting explanation is diminished. So I think that there is something to say about how predictive value and ability to intervene are part of justifying accounts. But I also think that by and large, when we look at scientists generating explanations, there's an acknowledged kind of shortcoming in overall predictive value, et cetera. So I think that's sort of zooming out. That's one of the big features of the kind of view of science that I'm putting together here is we have a kind of pluralism of accounts. And it's because each of our accounts serves particular aims of understanding or of prediction or et cetera. And individual accounts of a phenomenon are very unlikely to provide all of those things all at once. So we need lots of accounts. Sorry if that was too expansive of an answer at this stage.
Okay, so I think we are done with the session for today. Thank you so much, Professor Potochnik, for not just a great talk, but also engaging with us for so long and so enthusiastically. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure the participants all got a lot out of it. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll all be looking into your work a lot more now that we've become acquainted with it. So yeah, that is the end of tonight's talk. I will see all the participants tomorrow for the class, and yeah, we'll end it here. Thanks again. Thanks very much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, good
nice
night.
to engage with you.